Welcome to Talkin Maine with the Bowtie Boy. I'm Tom Saviello and my special guest, Michael Shephard from the Bangor Daily News. Michael, I didn't tell you this because you came in, but I didn't want to get you upset, but you promised me that you would be my campaign manager, so I've decided that I'm going to run.
Don't believe that, people. Don't believe it. It's not true. It's not true. He tried to work me over, but I resisted.
I offered him big bucks. He wouldn't take it. But
I never got to salary. Would have had to negotiate
You would have
that.
had to negotiate that. Well, I might have had $1 million to run with. I could have split that with you.
We could start there.
Okay, that'd be good. That'd be good. Well, Michael, thanks for coming back on the show again. Appreciate that.
Always great to be here in Farmington. I love the area.
And I want to commend you on the work you do. You may not write the way I want you to, but you always, what I know about Michael is you do your homework.
Thank you.
And that's appreciated. Watching even the campaign ad that we may talk about, how the Bangor Daily really dug into that. And that yours is not superficial reporting where someone hands you something and you just print it out so that you've got an article for that. So I appreciated that. Same with the reporters that work with you.
Yeah.
And we unfortunately just lost Caitlin, which was a good loss. I enjoyed working with Caitlin. She was good.
Yeah.
And I assume Lori's going to do some of the coverage that you've got before.
Yep, that's right.
So, Michael, we got a campaign season coming on.
Yep.
We kind of talked about this. And so just so the viewers know, we're not going to predict any races on this show or later on when Mike comes back on. Instead, in October, we'll do a show, and we'll both have a sealed envelope, and we'll have like 5 or 6 different things that are going on out there. Like, will it be a red wave?
Yeah.
Who's our next governor? Who's our next congressman? Will the state be Senate be Republican or Democrat? And the same thing in the House. And we'll put it in the sealed envelope. We'll give it to Andre. And then in November, after the election's over, assuming we're not still counting ballots or the election ballots are stolen, one or the other, or the hanging chads out there,
right.
We'll open those envelopes and we'll see who came the closest. Right. Is that a deal?
I think we can do that.
All right.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
It'll be fun. It'll be fun to do that. So you've seen some of the commercials that are going on TV. What's your impression of those things?
Yeah, we're just getting started. I mean, the big campaigns really got up on the air in August. Janet Mills and Jared Golden went up first in our 2 big races. They were pretty straightforward. They talked about kind of the consensus parts of their agenda. The other campaigns, Bruce Poliquin, Paula Page, have gone up with more biographical ads, more introductory ads. These are people who are, Mainers know them very well, of course. But there's been a little bit of a lag there, right? And I think so they're going with more of an introductory strategy. I think the interesting thing about that is Paula Page is leaning back on that life story, being homeless as a young child, victim of abuse and such. Really, it's a powerful life story that gave him a real shot of momentum back in 2010 when he first kind of burst onto the scene. Bruce Poliquin has tied himself to LePage a little bit. I think he's trying to lock down a Republican base that's been a little bit iffy on him before, right? LePage has one of the strongest bases I've ever seen in Maine politics, but it's not enough to get him elected at only that level. So he's got to build on that a little bit. That's his challenge. Bruce Poliquin needs to lock down conservative voters in a swing district where the Democratic incumbent has a little bit more strength with that group of people. So I think that's the strategy so far, and we're seeing it play out pretty consistently with the first month of the earnest ad war.
Yeah, and as we talked, one of the things that I learned in my career being around politicians is that the early ads, you want to try to brand yourself as something. Janet is trying to brand herself as a bipartisan governor who, with her daughters, they found a way to negotiate and live together and survive. And Jared is also trying to brand himself as this moderate, particularly in the commercial about the lobsters. Right. Although I wish he used something besides lobsters, but anyway, he's ripping the lobster apart and talking about how he stood up in Washington. And those are kind of branding themselves as this independent thinker that I represent you, but I represent everybody. It doesn't matter, Republicans, Democrats, or independents.
Right, and that's a common strategy early in campaigns. And you either want to brand yourself or brand the other guy, right, early on in a campaign. And I think that time that they had unanswered on the airwaves, it's not the case anymore. I mean, there are national groups now coming in, particularly against Jared Golden now. Yeah. But those early ads do have a big effect, and people who run campaigns tell you they'll see a little bit of a bump, in their polling when they get an unanswered crack at the other candidate. So we'll see how that washes out. It's going to be really overwhelming. It's barely started. Your mailbox is not yet full. Your airwaves are not yet full either. So it's gonna pick up pretty sharply.
And you talked about the polling bump. First time I was ever involved in a statewide campaign was the corridor. and that we would go out and poll and find out where we stood. And we were pretty consistently just below 50%, right, early on. You know, we had good numbers, they had lousy numbers. And then we polled questions. Would you more than likely move to our side if you knew they were going to create a clear cut? Would you be more likely to move to our side if you knew that the trout were all going to die? And we found out those things. So the next ads we came out with were geared towards that. And as you probably recall, most of them were around the clear cut. You know, we kept showing the pictures of the clear cut, kept doing that because we knew that was resonating. And then we polled after we ran some of that, and we had a huge bump.
Yeah.
So that told us where we needed to go. And the opposite of that was the retroactivity ad. They started running a bunch of stuff about retroactivity, and I got very concerned. So we polled, and they got no bump out of it, which was really interesting when we went through this. But that's what these politicians are doing. Did they run the negative ad as an example? Did they find that they gained some stuff?
Yeah, we're seeing that particularly right now in the 2nd District, where Republicans have come in with a really heavy buy against Jared Golden on national issues. They're attacking him on the Inflation Reduction Act, which is one of the rare big Democratic spending bills, right, that he was vociferously in support of. And what they're going to do is they're going to see how much that makes a difference, how much it tightens what we've seen. You know, back in the spring we saw a pretty wide gap with Golden on top of Poliquin. So what they're going to look at is they're going to constantly be learning, constantly be recrafting that strategy. And in 2020, Golden's challenger Dale Crafts, they pulled out, that October, and they figured out they couldn't move the needle. By election day, though, it was a 6-point gap. That was all built into, I think, the party's calculations on that. But nevertheless, I mean, you expect a race in such a conservative area, and the 2nd District is now a quite conservative district, not like it was a decade ago. Donald Trump won there comfortably. So they're going to see if that moves the needle, or if they need to change strategy, or if they don't feel like they're making progress, they'll pull out.
And I know in one of the generic polls, a Democrat versus a Republican in the 2nd District,
right,
Jared loses.
Well, yeah, the Democrat loses. Yeah.
But when you put names to it, it's the opposite way. So it's really interesting. You know, people are tired of some of the old politicians running again, and they see this branding going on. I mean, we talked about this briefly without going into specifics. I've seen campaigns where they've successfully branded a candidate early on as somebody you won't like. He pulled out of that, but then had a problem at the end that made a big difference in what the ultimate election is.
Well, and I've got a question too, how much branding is going to really have an effect in this race? I think everyone in Maine, I haven't met them if they don't, have an opinion of either Janet Mills or Paul LePage, and probably know pretty well how they're going to vote come November, or even earlier now because of the prevalence of absentee voting. I mean, look around your own life. Are there many mystery people? Do you have many undecided people? I mean, I think branding is only going to go so far in this race, and obviously there are going to be attempts to remind people of past things, and really going back over Governor Mills' management of spending, the pandemic, you name it. But and all that stuff matters, and I'm not trying to downplay it. But I think that in races like this, we've got the last guy to hold the seat running against the people who have the seats, and that is that builds in a lot of what people already know about these folks.
Absolutely, and I'll go back to the corridor again. We found that when we polled, 90% of the people made up their mind. That never changed, or 80%. So it never changed. It was that other 4 or 5% that you were going after, undecided and didn't know, let's say 8% undecided. That's what, and I suspect on the gubernatorial campaign, that's where we are. It's at 10% undecided that they're trying to figure out whose side they fall to.
Right. I mean, we haven't had public polling in these races since spring, but it was. And I think this race is going to be close. And if you're underestimating Paul LePage, think again. He's a little. I often compare him to like Nolan Ryan. It's not because he's got the amazing velocity, but you don't know, well, Nolan Ryan had the amazing velocity, and Paul LePage has his strengths and weaknesses, right? But you never knew if that fastball was coming down the middle or at your head.
Yeah, you got it.
And Paul LePage is he's a guy who ran a very good re-election race back in 2014. He stayed under control. By his standards, right? He tamped down the gaffes for the peak campaign season. He's really only had one gaffe this cycle, with threatening to deck a Democratic tracker, up in Madawaska. He's got some vulnerabilities. I think the abortion issue does hurt Republicans, and particularly hurts him. He's running to be the chief executive. But then again, this heating oil is really expensive right now, and we can feel the chill in the air right now, and that's never a great position for an incumbent to be in. So I really think that's going to be I really think if you think one candidate or another is going to be way out in front of that one, you're making a mistake.
And I think if you get to the Paul LePage and how he's running his campaign, he's going, as we talked before, as I call safe areas. He's going to Republican opportunities and working in his base to make sure he's got them good and solid. And then he's campaigning with Republican candidates. So I've seen pictures of Eric Brakey out with him campaigning. I've seen some pictures of other places that he's out campaigning and going into safe places and going into businesses that know him to keep him from getting into these confrontational situations.
I think that's, obviously that's part of it. But I think he's going to have to build up from that base at some point, right? It always, there are a lot of politicians, and you know a lot of them, who love campaigning to friendly crowds because it makes them feel good, but you've got to eventually, if you're in a competitive place, which he is, you got to get out of there and build your appeal to. Maybe it's just that 3 to 4% of voters who are undecided, but it's an awful lot in a close race. So we caught up with him. One of our reporters was out with him. We just showed up unannounced to one of these kind of listening tours that he was doing in the Portland suburbs, and it was actually kind of interesting. We started at a farmer's market where there were supporters of LePage's that were waiting to meet him, but they were a little nervous that he wouldn't get a very good reception at it, like the Falmouth farmer's market, because you don't know what's going to happen. Then later on the day, he held friendly events at a marina and a pep rally at a car dealer. And so we saw you get a good sense of how he's doing that. He's clearly trying to rally the base. I don't think the base needs much rallying. I mean, I think he's got I think 42% of the electorate pretty much locked down. But the question is, right, how he's gonna build on that number. And is he gonna get shellacked in the Portland suburbs, or stem his losses there and really run up the score in the 2nd district? And that was the Susan Collins playbook, right? Not necessarily winning around Portland, but holding her margins and allowing herself to really get that bump in northern Maine. So that's how he has to do it. There's really only one way to do it, and that's it.
And there's been a shift, because back when Angus King ran, that was one of the statewide elections that I first got involved politically. And I can remember Angus telling me he needed to win Lewiston, because no governor, I think, has ever lost Lewiston and become the governor. If it is, it's very infrequently. Yeah. And the second, he knew that Joe Brennan would have 34% of the vote. No matter what Joe Brennan did, 34% were going to vote for him. His goal was to make sure that Joe Brennan, that was in the first campaign, didn't gain more than the 34%. So I think the election was Joe Brennan got 34, Angus got 36 or 37, and Susan Collins got the rest.
Back in the 20s.
Back in the 20-something percent, which at that time was the Republican base. It was 25% that was out there. Right. So Paul LePage has got that 42% locked down. He's got to make the move out there. Does he get people that are independents, like my partner, as Christine, is someone who's alone, thinking about, I would say myself, but I think, I don't know who I'm voting for.
I don't know what you are anymore.
Nobody knows.
But he did, he did build on that in the 2014 election. He got, I think he got up to 47. There was, so there was some movement there. I think what's changed now is that Southern Maine has gotten bigger. Southern Maine has gotten more liberal. The path through the suburbs. I mean, back in 2010, when Republicans took over, you needed the Portland suburbs. You needed to win legislative seats in the Portland suburbs to get your slim majorities, right? And you got that. It's not happening so much anymore. So I think the path is hard for LePage, just given the math between the congressional districts. But at the same time, the polling that we saw back in the spring was basically, these two running relatively evenly in the congressional districts. And it's really going to be a matter of who wins theirs by more, I think, at the end of the day.
And I go back to the 2010 election. Also keep in mind, to me, what made the big difference was that the Democrats had just passed that big tax package. Right. Where they were going to tax haircuts and car repairs, but not tax golf courses and skiing. And to his credit, Charlie Webster organized the campaign. Dave Tran, I believe, headed it up. And it got a lot of Republicans out in these suburbs and other places that came to vote for Paul LePage versus, who did he run against? I forget.
Well, it was Libby Mitchell and Elliott Cutler.
Well, that was the other mistake the Democrats made. Libby Mitchell, by Labor Day, already knew she was going to lose with only 20% of the vote. She should have dropped out. Elliott Cutler would have been governor. Thank God he wasn't. Jesus. But that's another story.
Well, yeah, I mean, you got to remember 2010 too. It was really just, it's a cliche, but a perfect storm. You had 40 years of basically one party rule, right? And, particularly in the legislature. And then you've got the aftermath of the Great Recession. You've got the three-way split with a strong, at the time, right, independent candidate. You have the Democrats nominate the old hand, someone who was really the kind of politician who was on the outs with the electorate at that time. LePage was certainly brash and all the things, right, good and bad that you want to say about him, but he was. And we also remember, I mean, history is a funny thing. We remember some convincing victory. He just barely squeaked it out.
Yeah.
And allies of Cutler, for years have been saying that if they had another week, another week,
2 weeks, it was really turning
right.
around.
So it may never have happened. So then we never would have had the LePage era. We may have had a lot of other issues given Elliott Cutler's recent recent charges. But that is history. It can be kind of a rounding error sometimes, and we have to kind of remember how things could have gone under a different simulation, right? Just a little bit differently.
And even if you go back to that, when LePage got the nomination, is because Peter Mills and Les Auten divided up that moderate vote.
Well, and you could even expand that further to Steve Abbott, and Steve Abbott, who's probably one of the maybe of his generation, right? The top political strategist, Susan Collins, chief of staff. A lot of substantive candidates, frankly, in that race, and but Paul LePage, it was his time. It was the Tea Party wave, and he wrote it in.
Will abortion have anything to play, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we're seeing nationally, right? President Biden's approval rating is still pretty bad, but it's going up. We're seeing frontline Democrats in a lot of seats, be it Pennsylvania, other states like that, show pretty well in early polling in places where, if it was a Republican environment, they're probably losing those seats. Maine has permissive attitudes, right, toward abortion and permissive laws as well. Janet Mills has always been very solid on that issue. It's kind of one of her focal issues. I think that if it's going to be a campaign about abortion in Maine, the Republicans are going to lose it just because of the makeup of the state. But that being said, I think the polling has shown that the economy is still the top worry on people's minds. I think abortion has come up a little bit. We'll see if costs kind of tamp it down by the end. But these campaigns are all about, and the campaigns are working us to try to figure out to frame the focus of the election. So it's going to be the economy versus abortion versus education. There's going to be a lot of little things like that.
I mean, it's interesting because one of my students, when I taught political science here on campus, drew the chart. She was working on the gay marriage campaign, and she, the chart you draw is Democrats, Republicans, Independents. Always votes, sometimes votes, never votes. Yeah. And so when you're running a campaign, the ones that are in your party, you're pretty sure you're going to get their vote. So you want to focus on the sometimes votes and the independents. Yeah. She said what they did on the gay marriage is they went to the Democrat and the independent and they focused on never votes. And they really went after them and got them to the polls. It's similar to what they did in Kansas. I believe they went after that segment of the voting population, got them out. So if I were the Democrats and I was their strategist on general elections in here, that's where I'd be making my phone calls and reminding them about abortion and that it's been taken away. And these guys have the ability, if they become the majority, they could take it away from us.
Well, right, and that's a big if, right? At this point, Paul LePage would have to win, and he would have to have pretty solid Republican majorities. Back when you were in the Republican majority, there weren't enough anti-abortion Republicans to pass anti-abortion laws, so they all got shot down pretty easily. And it wasn't a big focus of yours. It wasn't a big focus of the leaders at the time. It certainly wasn't a focus of yours, but the party is more solid on that issue, meaning that if the Republicans had even a slim majority, the odds would be much higher that they would be able to advance these things. Now, whether they would think it was a smart thing to do, whether it's a top priority, I think that's an open question, and it probably wouldn't be their top priority if they got elected from a pure strategy perspective, because it would cause a backlash, and you might be right back in the position you were in 2012 when the Republicans were swept out of power and Paul LePage kind of had a wandering rest of his tenure trying to deal with a split executive branch and legislature. So when you get into office, right, it sounds easy, but you want to do popular things and you want to make sure people know you do popular things. So I think there's some open question as to whether, not just whether Republicans have the desire to do it, but whether they will do it. I think it's a question.
And I add to the popular things is also what your constituents want. Go back to Medicaid expansion. You know where I stood on that. One day I was against it the first day it first came out. And then when I started reading into it and realized what my district needed, that's when I changed my whole tune about that.
Right.
I got criticized terribly by some of the Republicans.
Oh, yeah.
But I said, no, it's the right thing to do. Maine, what do you hear about the Maine legislature? Anything at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the closest groups of legislative races in the country. There are some people who will tell you it's the most interesting and the closest because of the kind of interesting splits between the chambers. We usually have thought about legislative races in the Senate being a little bit easier to flip, only 35 seats, right? And there's usually a pretty solid group of well, there's usually a solid group of incumbents, but usually 5 to 7 districts that are quite swingy. They'll go one way or the other depending on candidate quality. This time around, it looks like the House might be a little bit more in play, given redistricting, some of the changes that have come there. So most of the operatives and some national groups who, national prognosticators who look at this think the House is a little more maybe accessible for Republicans this time. The Senate's still going to be in play. There are some big races, including Senate President Troy Jackson in a real fight up in his district with Representative Sue Bernard. So it's a socially conservative area, right? That's kind of hanging on to the last few Democrats, probably. I think it's going to be a conservative area at some point.
It used to be. Back in the day of Governor Reed, there were 3 Republicans that used to come down from the county.
Right. It's gone from Republican to Democrat, and it seems to be going back in the other direction. So I think he's in a real fight. I think you could see an election honestly where Democrats hang on, the big name Democrats that we've talked about, Janet Mills, Jared Golden, hang on, but you lose a big name legislator, or you lose a few people that you didn't expect to, or Republicans take one chamber, and squeak in. I think all of these things are on the table. I'm not saying those things are going to be the things that happen, but I could certainly see there's always one surprise in these elections. Back in 2012, Democrats destroyed the Republicans, but John Martin, the former speaker and kind of titan of politics, and he got beat. So
as Charlie Webster put $60,000 of money could have spent into the other races into that race just because he wanted to spite John, and that was sad because I like John, I got along with John, but there could have been other races that were very close that if he'd spent a little bit of money there, it might have made a difference, and we might have had a number. But they lost like 20 seats. We lost like 20 seats or 30 seats that year, and the Senate dropped from. We had 23, and we were down to 12.
So you got John Martin. That was your bright spot.
Yeah, we got John Martin. Yes, like, well, whoopee. Well, it didn't do us any good, or didn't. Not us. I'm not a Republican.
And then he came back.
And then he came back at the end because he knew what was going on. And NATO, who he ran against, they found out he wasn't really the best manager of his financial situation anyway.
Well, it's just one of those things that but these races, legislative races, are full of surprises, and you can never really figure out what's going on there all the time. Even when you're running the campaigns, there are things that just happen under the radar, and voters move in one direction or the other, and there's always a surprise. So I think we're going to see a lot of mixed results, and Republicans have been doing much better inland. Democrats have been doing much better on the coast. It used to not be like that, or it used to be at least more mixed, and now it's gotten, since 2016, those patterns have kind of gotten more crystallized. So
it's going to be interesting to me because even in the race here at home, you've got Russell running. You've got Stan running, and you've got Doug Thomas. Now, Doug Thomas was a Republican. He's very conservative, and he's decided to run as an independent. Does he siphon enough votes off of Russell up in the northwest corner of the state, like Jackman, the Forks, and so forth, that now come down and make a difference because Stan will do better in Farmington, particularly at the university. Right. Russell will do better in the fringe towns around that. Does that now create a significant race here?
I think that's a really interesting race that isn't really on many people's radar. And you're right, Russell Black is a very conservative guy. Doug Thomas is probably a little more conservative, a former state senator, but represented a different area of the state, really. And he's coming down from Ripley on the kind of the edge of Somerset County to run a district really that's centered on Farmington and in this area. So I think it's a tough geography for him to break into, right? That typically you wouldn't run out of an area like that to try to get into a seat like this, but that's where redistricting placed him, and he wanted to come back. So he's almost running a primary in a general election. And does he come out? If he comes away with 15-20% of the vote, then that seat is in play, and probably a Democrat who wins it, it is going to be very vulnerable the next time. But this time around, I think it's in play.
And for the viewers, so you understand, every year we do the census in the 10-year or the 0-year. Ultimately, 2 years later, Maine redistricts so that they can make sure that we have the right proportions to one person, one vote without the state. And so the districts change as a result of that, and there's some changes that took place that may actually favor some of the Republicans in some of the House races, which could help them a lot. Plus, there were a number of more Democrats, I believe, that turned out in both the House and the Senate than we've seen in a long time.
Right.
I think the challenge is still going to be in the Senate for them. I think the House maybe has some possibilities, but it's going to be tough to overturn.
Well, what could fight that a little bit is that the Senate Republicans have usually been much more organized and a little, usually have a little more money. House Republicans are going through a little bit of a leadership issue. There's a faction of more conservative Republicans who are kind of taking on the leaders, and the House Minority Leader Kathleen Dillingham from Oxford is termed out. So there's a little bit of uncertainty about who's going to lead that. I think that's the vulnerability for them, but certainly on the ground they have a pretty decent situation.
And in fact, as we get close to the end, that's one of the things that I also have observed is that Trump has been very successful, if we use Trump, or even LePage, successful in getting some candidates into these positions if they had a primary, because the primary tends to be the conservatives come out and vote. Right. Now, does that really hurt them when they get into the general election? Because now even the moderate Republicans might say, that's right, but I'm not going to vote for that guy.
There weren't too many hot legislative primaries on the Republican side this year. There were some interesting ones on the Democratic side, but I think there are a few races, particularly 2 or 3 that more moderate challengers lost to more conservative ones, and I think on the margins that could hurt Republicans certainly. One thing that we've observed, right, since I began covering politics was right around 2010 is like the legislators that we're seeing now are really the children of Paul LePage. And it's starting to be a Donald Trump thing as well, where people are getting involved in politics. Really, sometimes their involvement in politics doesn't go much back any farther than that, or has just begun more recently. And then that's a pattern that's always happened in politics, right? People get inspired to get in at certain times. But I think we're seeing, the Republican Party was not as reliably for LePage when he was the governor. I think now we see a party that's much more amenable to him and his policy goals.
So, Michael, as we said, we draw to a close in about a month. We'll come back on again and see what we've observed, what's changed since this conversation and dialogue. Does we find out that Paul LePage didn't pay his taxes, or that Janet Mills ran with the dogs, something like that may turn it. We'll find out. But we'll come back in and we'll talk, and we'll bring in our sealed envelope. We'll email back and forth the 4 or 5 things that we want to do in that, and we'll have this conversation again.
It'll be a very secure process.
It would be very secure. We'll give it to the Price Waterhouse talliers of information, and that when we have it, just like the Emmys, Andre will present us the envelopes.
Hopefully don't do the Warren Beatty thing.
Right. Michael, as always, it's a pleasure. This is a great conversation. We'll see you next time on Talkin' Maine. Stay tuned for October and then for November for the grand opening.